Jerry Kelly is an independent designer, calligrapher, and printer in New York City. He has produced award-winning work from fine books and pamphlets to brochures and ephemera for organizations including the Grolier Club, the Morgan Library, the Rochester Institute of Technology, Columbia University, and others. Previously a designer for Steinauer Press and the press of A. Colish, he has taught at Pratt Institute, Parsons School of Design, and Queens College. He's written several books and numerous articles on printing, calligraphy, and related subjects, notably A Century for the Century and Artist and Alphabet. Welcome, Jerry, to the Bibliophile again.
Thank you, Nigel. Thanks for inviting me again.
I'm going to reference another book of yours called The Best of Both Worlds, finally printed Livre d'Artistes 1910 to 2010. You say the essence of fine bookmaking is the bringing together of disparate elements to form a harmonious whole. In the best examples, paper, font, layout, presswork, and binding are all superlative, but it is not sufficient that these various factors all be of the highest quality. In order for a book to reach the highest echelons of the art, every attribute must interact with each of the others to make for a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And then the whole must still be appropriate for the given text, and if applicable, the artwork contained within the volume. So what I want to do is look at each of those elements with you as they pertain to what you have spent a good part of your career doing, which is designing catalogs. So why catalogs?
Well, that's an interesting question. I wouldn't say it's my choice. I'd say that the marketplace of catalogs often requires better production than, let's say, your average novel published by your average publisher that winds up at Barnes & Noble. A lot of the catalogs I did for book dealers, and, you know, if you're a book person, the qualities of a fine book are going to appeal to your clientele. And also, of course, art galleries and museums. A lot of work I have done is for art galleries and museums. And of course, they too want to present the artwork in a way that tries to be worthy of the subject. You know, you don't want to do a book on Rembrandt's etchings and have these beautiful, high quality, to put it mildly, objects in a shoddy, showing up in a shoddy guise. So, you know, I can't say that I went knocking on doors. I actually never go knocking on doors and, you know, went to people who are producing catalogs. I would say that people who produce catalogs want someone who's going to give some care and try to clothe their material in an appropriate and attractive way.
Okay. So just to kind of put a focus on our conversation, I want to go through some of the work that you've done and look at, for example, Camellia. Is that how we pronounce it?
No, it's Camellia. Camellia. It's a Latin word. And, you know, in Latin, actually, a C is pronounced like a K. So if you were to pronounce the great Roman orator and politician correctly, it would be Cicero, not Cicero. But that word, which means treasures, I believe, is pronounced Camellia.
Okay, and this was a catalog, Catalog 165, produced by you and others for H.P. Krauss, the bookseller.
Mm-hmm. Probably the world's foremost bookseller. Actually, there's little doubt about that.
Is that right?
Oh, yes. He was considered the greatest bookseller of his time. I think there's little doubt about that. I don't think anyone who knows the rare book world would deny that H.P. Krauss was the greatest bookseller of his time.
And why was that?
Because he sold great books. Because he had a lot of guts. I think these books are, you know, they spend a lot of money hoping to make a lot of money. And, he handled the most amazing books. But that's out of my field. I'm just saying that it's the word on the street is that H.P. Krauss was the greatest bookseller of his time. And I don't think there's a bookseller who would deny that.
Okay.
Yeah, he was the greatest bookseller of his time because he made nice catalogs. That's what I'll say.
That's right. Well, he's the greatest bookseller of his time because he hired the greatest catalog.
No, that's not
right?
the way it works. That's not the way it works.
Okay, so this is, first of all, it's hardcover. So why did you make it hardcover?
Well, Nigel, I'd say at that time, most of H.P. Krauss's catalogs had been hardcover from, let's say, the late 40s to the 80s. Most of his catalogs, not all were hardcover. But there's actually an even more direct answer in this case. I don't know if you have a list of questions there. This may knock out your next 20 questions.
I don't work on lists. I don't collect books off lists.
Well, there was a catalog done of the great collection in Germany, Ludwig, I think it was, the Ludwig collection. You know about that book, 4 volumes. And it was sold by Jake Zeitlin, I believe, in California to an institution in Cologne, I believe. Ludwig was in Cologne. And they did this monumental catalog. And a lot of the books from the Ludwig collection had been sold by H.P. Krauss to Herr Ludwig. And that was 4 volumes, hardcover, with a lot of tip-in plates, bright red laminated dust jacket. And I was told that we wanted to do something. And I think our book, the Camellia, is the same size as the Ludwig book. I don't want to call it a model because the typography is totally different and the design is totally different from the Ludwig. But as far as the size, having a lot of tip-in plates, hardcover, this was all dictated by something that would be in the vein of that Ludwig catalog.
Okay, so you didn't exercise your eye on this then. There were certain parameters you had to work with.
Oh, there were parameters, but I exercised my eye. I would disagree with that statement. The parameters of the size, the color of the dust jacket, and a lot of tip-in plates were all dictated.
Okay.
But no, everything else I'd say is completely different from the Ludwig. The typefaces are different. That's very important to me. The page layout is different. We printed this book letterpress. The Ludwig collection book is not printed letterpress.
Yeah.
But there were parameters of the size of the book, the red dust jacket. I believe those books had a green cloth binding too, but the binding design is totally different also. That the Camellia has a colored panel and gold on the spine, and the Ludwig, I think, is just, type on the spine. So no, the design was completely different.
Okay, so what's the paper, if you can recall, and why did
I recall that paper. It's a very, very strange, that's not an easy question. There is a fellow, Tom Whitridge, who was my predecessor at Colish. Have you come across Tom's name at all?
Vague.
He did a lot of book production and book design, and he worked at Coalish before I did. He had the position as Bert Clark's assistant that I got when he left Coalish. And Tom did this huge book for the Bank of Mexico. It was a history of Mexico, a very important early history of Mexico in Spanish from the, I think, 17th century. They did a reprint of it. That's a very deluxe book for the Bank of Mexico. And he had paper specially made for it by the Monadnock Mill. They made special paper. Monadnock was the mill, a very good mill. They're still in business.
Where is this?
Monadnock is I think they're in Massachusetts, or maybe New Hampshire, because there's Monadnock Mountain in New Hampshire. It's probably New Hampshire. And there are paper mills still around making good paper, but he had a specially made paper with that nice little bit of texture and a nice cream shade. They had an overrun on the paper that we bought for this catalog, but when they made the paper, they made too much, and so we bought paper. So it's a special paper, special making of Monadnock that was initiated by Tom for this Bank of Mexico project. And
it's nice and thick so that the letterpress bite is very apparent.
And it has a little texture so that bite will show even more because it smooths down the surface. It was a lovely paper.
So why did you choose that?
Just for the reasons we said. It has a lovely texture, nice shade. It's nice that it is not like any other paper around. it just seemed to have a lot of the qualities we were after, and it was available at the time. So yeah.
It's kind of exclusive. It works with the color of the dust jacket. Was that?
Well, it works. It's a nice cream tone. Those cream tones are tougher than you think. You don't want them to be too yellow. They look fake. We didn't want a bright white in this case. We want something a little, warm and subtle. So it's a nice tone, lovely texture. Tom worked pretty hard on getting exactly those qualities. Just you don't want it too textured. You don't want it too smooth. And so we loved it. And also it was formulated to print letterpress, because that Bank of Mexico book was letterpress also. So it was formulated for letterpress printing. So it was just what we needed.
Let me just drill down a bit more, though. You said, warm and comfortable. And so why did you want that?
Because we wanted a classic look. These are older books, manuscripts. The whiter papers to me look more modern. And so sometimes if I'm doing a book on, let's say I did a book on Wallace Stevens or, I would want a more modern look. James Joyce, I've done a few catalogs, and we use a whiter paper for those. Still not a bright white, but, this creamier, it has a little bit of an older classic look, let's say classical look.
Well, and you know what? It just turns out that a lot of these images that are glued into the book have a kind of a creamy...
Yep, the vellum that a lot of the original artwork was done on would have been that tone. Right, so it was appropriate for that reason.
Anything else on the paper?
No, like I said, it was formulated for letterpress. It was distinctive, high quality.
Okay.
You mentioned that it was thick. A big... I don't know if you were going to ask about this. A big issue with that book was how to handle technically so many Tippins. That's actually a difficult thing. And so you don't want too thin a paper for tipping in. The glue buckles the paper a little. That's inevitable. But if it's too thin a paper, the buckling will show more. And we had, I don't know, I think it may have been 172 Tippins or something in that book.
Yeah.
And that's a binder's nightmare. We had to do some very special things. I don't know if you noticed with the bindery, and I don't know if you want me to go on about that. Maybe later you'll want to know. But there were some very special things with the binding of that book that had to be done to handle so many Tippins.
Well, let's do that, because let's go with the binding then. When I picked the book up, there is a very slight, and there is a very slight kind of little bow to it.
Yep, and you're right. There has to be. Yeah. It has to be because of all those Tippins, but it's much less than it would have been otherwise. You see, the real trick, I don't know if you noticed anything at the gutter, at the spine of the book.
This is on page 48. It was funny because I just was double checking, because there's a piece of paper sticking out and it looks like it's been torn off. And for a moment, I thought they'd torn a freaking page out.
No, that's it. There were a bunch of those. I think every 16 pages or so. You see, the trouble is that if you have that many Tippins, the spine will be much thinner than the middle of the book. And that just doesn't work. You just can't get a book to work that way. So you have to have these stubs at the spine. And that's what you're seeing there. So what we did was actually perforate the sheet. The book was bound, and then they had to be pulled out so that the spine would have adequate thickness. Otherwise, the bowing you see would have been much more, but it would have just been totally impractical. So it was a production challenge, we'll say, and a real challenge to the binder to handle that.
Well, I mean, and isn't that very much what you do? Is, these are problems and you solve them.
Well, yes, often I have to do that. I'm a book designer, Nigel, as you know, and sometimes a lot of stuff comes along with that.
So obviously you like solving problems. I mean, there are some of us that would get very frustrated and annoyed.
It's both, Nigel. I get very frustrated and I like solving it. I would say it's both. Yes. Okay. It goes with the territory. With the territory. You have to do it.
Now, the binding itself is just gorgeous. It's, the actual cloth, it's textured.
It was imported from Holland. It's a Von Schokel cloth, if I recall correctly, called Coraletta, something like that, Coraletta cloth. And it had that heavy texture that, we found appealing.
So why did you find it appealing?
Because it's such a big book that, it's 9 by 12 or maybe larger than 9 by 12. If you had a smooth cloth, it would look a little dull, maybe. The larger the book, the more you want a little, something interesting. On a small book, that cloth the texture would overwhelm the appearance. But on a large book like that, to get the texture to show, you want to have a bit of texture. So we found that extra texture very appealing.
Just appealing, but why appealing?
Because I think it would look a little pedestrian to have a smooth cloth on a book that size, to have something, it'll look very plain in a way. And if you want a little texture to show, a fine texture is good on a 6 by 9 book or even, 7 by 10. But when you get to 9 by 12, or it may have even been 10 by 14, that book, I can't recall.
I think it is, yeah.
It was pretty large. You need a little more texture for it to show.
Okay. Well, it is certainly noticeable. Not that I could afford anything in the book. And of course, the mission is to sell this stuff in the book, right?
Yes, and they sold everything.
Did they? Oh, on block. Okay.
I think wait, am I right? Oh, something, it may be the Ludwig collection, that 4-volume that sold en bloc to the Getty. I may be wrong about that. I'm sorry. It may be the Ludwig collection, but I think that catalog did very well. I will tell you this, Nigel. It was the first catalog I ever did for H.P. Krauss. I did a book of his poetry before that.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I did.
I bet you that wasn't a big seller.
No, it was 100 copies for private distribution. None was sold. But this was the first catalog, and after that catalog, I did all their catalogs for the next years. As a matter of fact, I did almost all their catalogs, I think, until they closed. I think so. So it must have worked well for the firm.
Well, yes. If you told me recently, it's like, well, how can you tell how successful your efforts to help them sell the books is? Well, they keep hiring you back.
Oh, did I say that? Okay, that's good. I contend it's impossible to show a direct correlation between a beautiful catalog and book sales. But on the other hand, I actually like that. I forgot I had said that. Yeah, if they keep on coming back to you, they must think it's working.
This wasn't your very first catalog, period, though. It was your first.
It may have been.
Because if it is, then I get quite a bit more excited now that I own it.
I may have done. Well, no, I think that may be the first complete catalog. I did some early covers for Glenn Horowitz before I started doing his catalogs.
Right.
That may be the first catalog I ever did. As I said, Krauss, and this was through Kit Curry. Kit Curry worked at H.P. Krauss, and she was a rare book expert and cataloged books and did what all these rare book dealers do. But also she was more or less in charge of the publications. And so when H.P. Krauss wanted to do a little book of his poetry in German from when he was in Europe, she came to me for that at Colish, and I did that. And she did say afterwards that she found working together on that to be so workable. I don't know. I'm looking for a better word.
Jerry, you're smooth.
Smooth. That's not a bad word. That she wanted this big catalog to go smoothly.
I mean, obviously, that's a big part of it, too. I mean, if you are going to continue to work with someone, it has to be a good experience for everyone, right?
That's right.
So how do you make it a good experience?
Well, I'd say my first answer to that is that you come up with a good product at the end. I have one particular book dealer who I've done a lot of work for, and I think, at the end, if somebody comes up to him and says, "Hey, that's a nice looking catalog," he's happy. So you make it smooth by making it, and that happens, that nice product at the end, without too much angst, too much Sturm und Drang along the way. That you try to take care of whatever issues might come up. So that's how you make it smooth. But in the end, I think a nice looking catalog that the dealer customers will say to them, "Oh, that's a nice looking catalog." That's the most important thing.
It reflects well on them, obviously.
That's right.
Okay, we then turn to the type, the font. Do you have any recollection about that?
Oh, Nigel, please. Fonts are my type is my thing. And of course I remember that the book is set in Bembo with Emerson used for the display type. And the word camellia was hand lettered by yours truly, printed from hand lettering. But it's set in Emerson and Bembo, that book. Yes, of course I remember.
Okay, and why did you pick those?
Well, Bembo is a Renaissance Roman type based on a type from 1495 for Aldus Manutius. It's a wonderful type design that, speaks of classicism and elegance, similar to what we spoke about with the paper. That's, kind of not too modern, historical look. And the Emerson we used for the caps just because they're a little heavier. So it would make those title lines show up just a little more. I don't like bold type and I avoid it. I use it occasionally, but it was not a place for bold type. You don't want that kind of crude, heavy look. You want an elegant look. But Emerson had a little more weight that made the title line stand a little more.
And obviously it works with Bembo. I mean, there are types.
They're both based on Renaissance Roman letter forms, right?
I see. Okay.
As opposed to a Bedoni or a Baskerville, which would be, a different style, a more modern transitional or neoclassical. But Emerson and Bembo are both based on Renaissance style.
Okay, so the choice to put the titles in capitals, pretty straightforward. I mean, that's the most important item.
Right, to make them stand out, right. It's a big page and you want to focus on that page. And of course, the focus would be the title. The item number was pretty big too. You want that to be a focus also.
Yes, and I guess this is fairly common practice. There aren't any prices in the catalog. There's a sheet that's...
Right, a separate price list. They always did. Well, I shouldn't say almost always H.P. Krauss did that, and a lot of other dealers did that too. I think they wanted to have the flexibility of changing prices if they so desired. And it could be also that they saw these catalogs more as a lasting record of these books. And, that the sales aspect is separate from that.
Yeah, as a resource for scholars.
Mm-hmm. They put a lot of effort into the scholarship in those books.
Plus, money is crass, Jerry.
I agree with you, Nigel. I agree. That's right. Keep it segregated from the sanctity of the book, right?
And then you have a smaller type, and you identify references pretty well on each book, and you put the titles in italics.
That's pretty standard.
Why do they do that?
To separate out the titles, just so that you can see at a glance, this is a title.
Okay, we did the binding, we got the font, we got the paper.
We covered those things, but also there's the printing. The text was all printed letterpress from metal type. This is not done terribly often, even in the 80s, so they wanted something special in that way. And the plates were all printed 4-color offset. All of those 172, I think, I don't remember, but maybe 172 plates. I think we printed them all on 4 or 5 sheets, on these huge sheets, and then they had to be cut out. I do remember, even though it was 40 years ago, that when I was doing the layout, I was actually a designer, not a production person at Colish. But to get these plates all to fit on the sheets was complicated, and I was doing the layout, and I remember the production person come to me and say, "Boy, I'm glad you're doing that, and not me," as they walk by. Because you had to figure them all to cut. It was very complicated to get these images that were printed so many up on a sheet to cut out with a pretty even margin all around. It was a technical challenge.
Well, then you had to go and stick them in the book too. Well,
somebody did. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. But it was a separate company. It was a separate company from the binder. We had a binder, bound the books with those perfect, and then it went to a company in Long Island City in Queens who did had a lot of handwork for bindery projects. They did a lot of custom boxes, but we needed someone, it was all handwork to tip them in. Yeah, I remember going there and setting them up. We put all the plates that had to be tipped in a row, in a line, and they tipped them in and pulled out those perforated pages that were used to bulk up the spine. So that was a separate company that did a lot of hand operations.
I don't know if they're perforated, Jerry. They look like they've ripped out.
They were perforated. Does it have that rough an edge?
Yeah. It looks like they were pages that were ripped out of the book.
They were perforated. I'm sure of it. I actually wondered if you even noticed them. I thought they were buried enough in the spine that they would not be too noticeable, but they are noticeable. These stubs, they're called. What's left?
Yeah. Can you tell me a bit about? Is it Colish?
Yes, a Colish.
Can you give me a little thumbnail on them?
Sure. Abe Colish came over from Europe with his mother in the early 1900s, maybe even 1890s. Immigrants from, I believe, Russia or Poland, fleeing what was going on with Jewish people in Russia and Poland at the time. He came over with his mother. And the story is that they came off the boat and somehow Abe went away for a walk, this young man, and his mother was frantic because he didn't come back because he actually had found a job that day at a printer's setting type.
That's a land of opportunity right there.
Instant opportunity.
Instant opportunity.
And he was a very good typesetter. There was a huge business in advertising typography. This is, by the way, Grandpa's did a lot of advertising typography too in California. He set up a shop, eventually, his own business, setting type for advertisers. And at some point pretty early on, some of these advertisers said, your typesetting is so good. I wish you were printing for us. We want that kind of quality on printing. So he started the press of A. Colish. And that was 1907.
Where is that?
It was in Manhattan in the East 40s. There were a lot of printing companies in East 40s. As a matter of fact, photo lettering, lasted there until the 90s or even later. That East 40s was a center of printing. And so he had a, space in a building, and the company flourished and grew and grew. And then in 1955, he built a building in Mount Vernon, New York, about a half hour north of New York. Built a building, beautiful building, to be his expanded printing operations. That was 48 years later, after 1907, after the company was founded. But he moved and expanded and was very successful. His son got into the business. His son, Lou, became chairman. And when I joined Coalish in 1981, Lou was the owner of the company. Abe had died, I think, in 67, maybe. Abe died many years before. When I joined the company, Lou was in his 80s. He was the owner. His son-in-law was president of the company, Steve Emerson. And Coalish did a lot of work for Bruce Rogers, did several books for Bruce Rogers, a lot of books for the Limited Editions Club. Coalish did a lot of quality printing, also a lot of printing for pharmaceutical companies. That was very lucrative, and for advertising clients.
Like flyers and brochures and stuff.
Flyers and brochures, very, very tricky work, very, fussy work, let's say.
Yeah. So would you say that Steinauer is in that same tradition?
Definitely. Yeah. They were competitors, Steinauer and Coalish, and Steinauer lured me away from Coalish. They saw, we were competitors. We often bid on the same projects, and and also Steinauer had letterpress and offset. Well, they had letterpress and they did offset with Meriden Gravure, and eventually acquired Meriden Gravure. As a matter of fact, when I started at Coalish, it may have been just about the time that Steinauer and Meriden merged. They were actually acquired, Meriden. And Coalish was doing that too, letterpress and offset. And once in a while, there was even a project we collaborated on. There was a book of Georgia O'Keeffe's drawings that Bert Clark designed beautifully. I think it was called Memories of Drawing by Georgia O'Keeffe. And we set the type for that at Coalish, and Bert designed it beautifully. Beautiful little book. And Steinauer and Meriden Steinauer printed it. So our paths crossed all the time. We were in a very similar world. The thing that Coalish had, that Steiner didn't, Coalish had this commercial side of it too. They had, most of their work was commercial printing, as I said, for drum companies and other clients. And so that was a very firm financial base. And Steinauer did very little of that kind of commercial printing.
Yeah, Rocky went out, talked to all the universities across the country to do work for them, right?
Yeah. Rocky had a large clientele among universities and museums and galleries. And, Colish did museums and galleries, a little university work, a little university press work. So we were in the same world. I would say Steinauer had a lot more of that work. And as I said, Colish had a lot more commercial work.
Okay. And so how did they print this then? On what?
The letterpress was printed on, we had 2 Heidelberg cylinders. We had, at Coalish, we had 2 Heidelberg cylinders, a Mealy vertical, which was good for ephemera and envelopes and smaller jobs. And we had this huge old press, letterpress, that we used very rarely because the Heidelbergs were much more efficient. But we had a very large press. Matter of fact, once in a while, we got a job because we had the only press large enough to print it, letterpress. But the letterpress for the Camellia was printed on 2 Heidelberg cylinders, wonderful machines. And the offset at that time, Colish had nothing but, I believe, Miller presses. Was it Miller or Mealy? I think they were Miller offset presses. We had 1 50-inch, 2 44-inch Miller presses at the time we printed that book. They got rid of those a few years later and went only with 40-inch, what was the name of it? 40-inch offset presses. But at the time, we had a 44-inch Miller and a 50-inch Miller. And we had a very large, we had a 60-inch offset press too, but that was, again, for oversized projects.
And this was in Mount Vernon?
Mount Vernon, New York, right.
Is that building still around?
The building is still around. The building, when Colish merged with Laurel Printing just before I left, so in 90 or so, the building was sold to, I think, a furniture warehouse or something. It was a nice building on Hartford Avenue. It is still around. The building is still around. Yes.
So us literary tourists can get out and.
Well, I don't know if these furniture company or whatever's there now will be interested in letting you in. And I don't think there's any remnant of, these buildings were big empty spaces. That's basically what it is. There's nothing that exciting to see.
Okay. You said it was a nice building, though.
It was a nice building. It was built. Yeah. It was specially built, purpose built for printing. It had offices in the front and a glass enclosed section of the building. And otherwise, in Embley, it was just a big empty space, a loading dock in the back, But, I had been at the Meriden Gravure Company, as I mentioned, and Steinauer, and those companies were old buildings that had been added to. It was a Warren's den at Meriden. I remember there's this building connected to that building, and then they expanded to that building. And we had a nice building. Of course, Meriden did beautiful printing, so who cares about the building? The printing was absolutely fantastic, and Steinauer did very good printing also. But Steinauer, when they actually acquired Meriden, you could say merged with Meriden, after a couple of years, they moved the offset printing at Meriden up to Lunenburg, Vermont. They built a building, especially for the offset part. The letterpress was still in the older buildings. But like I said, that was building attached to building, and this was a specially built building for printing. So it was a nice building.
I like the story about how, the fact that customers, they put them up for a few days.
At Steinauer, you mean?
At Steinauer, yeah.
Yes, because why else? How else could they get anybody to go to the remote part of? It was way up there, way north, but also it wasn't close to any air. It was 45 minutes, an hour to the nearest airport. Yeah. So yes, they had to make it appealing in some way.
Did they feed him as well?
I don't think so. There was. I had to go up there several times when I worked for them. I worked for them for, 8 years or so. And there were these, greasy spoons around. There were some nicer restaurants, a half hour, 45 minutes away. It was rare, I think, that Steve Steinauer or Rocky had someone over. I was over at Steve's once for dinner, maybe. No, maybe more than that. Anyway, there were restaurants. They made it. I'm sure they didn't starve. Yeah.
I was so thrilled to get out to interview Rocky. I have a picture of him. I took a photograph of him out in the field there, and that's how I remember him.
Right. What year did you interview him? When was that?
It's got to be I don't know, 10, 12, maybe more years ago.
Yeah, because he had diabetes at the end. I think it was on dialysis.
Yeah.
But yes, he had a spread there. Well, there's some great stories that Joe Blumenthal told me, mainly about Rocky, that he bought that land and a press, the Bisbee Press. You probably heard that from him about the Bisbee Press that he bought. But there was a lot of land that came along with the Bisbee Press. So he had a big spread out there.
Yeah. Well, speaking about big spread, I just want to move on now to the Grolier Club. I had the thrill of interviewing Stephen Lamezo.
Oh, yes.
About
project. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was happily surprised to see that you designed the catalog to go along with that exhibition, Magazines in the American Experience. Now, we're fast forwarding.
About 40 years. Yeah.
We're fast forwarding, about 40 years. So obviously the technology has changed quite significantly.
Good point. Yes.
What's happened in those 40 years in terms of actual printing technology?
Well, how long do you have, Nigel? Do you have a week or two to go over this? I'm going to give you the short answer first, and then maybe go a little more into that. But I will say that, everybody likes to go around saying, oh, things were so much better in the old days, and, the good old days and the quality of the old. Printing today is so much better than it was 40 years ago or 20 years ago. So if you go to Barnes & Noble today and you pick up a book, that book from an average publisher, just done not quite down and dirty, but let's say quickly and efficiently and economically, the quality of that book is better than any time in the history of printing since Gutenberg. Now, there was some great printing all along. I'm not saying it's the same quality as Kelmscott, but I'm saying overall, the average book today is so much better. So the technology is fantastic. We used to paste up, type and pictures on boards, and it could be a little crooked. Now you don't even think crooked type doesn't come up in you don't have a crooked paragraph in the middle of the page. And, the early phototype, there'd be density issues. Some of the type would be a little darker and we don't appreciate it today that the density of type is perfect. The technology, the digital technology is fantastic for type and printing, and the accuracy. When the Camellia book was done, just to give you some idea, when that book was done, and as I said, we had this big 44-inch sheet that we were pasting up or printing dozens of these illustrations. They were individual pieces of film, 4 pieces of film for each color image to make color, for full color. And each one of those was taped onto what they call a flat, onto a piece of very stable, flexible plastic by hand. And it had to match dot to dot with another piece. So the yellow had to match the red. They did it on a light table. But that took a lot of skill. And believe me, it wasn't always perfect. To get those things in register, putting it on a plate that could stretch a little, shouldn't stretch a little, but could on a press, and bolting that plate to the press, and if it's a little off, it won't register right and it won't look. That was a lot of work, and it was very difficult to achieve. Now, the digital technology, register is perfect. You don't have the problems like we did back then.
It's funny that comes up in old movies as a comparison. You watch Citizen Kane, where all sorts of incredible innovations took.
Right.
The problem is, of course, we're completely used to all of that and way better.
Right.
And the original movie doesn't look like such a big deal, even though it took a huge amount of work.
Right. It was so much more difficult to achieve those effects.
Exactly. And it's the same with the magazines of the 50s and 60s.
Definitely. And also, this has brought down the cost of all these things. So printing today, what you get for your dollar in printing today is much more, adjusted for inflation, blah, 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 et cetera, than you got before. So that's why there's such a proliferation of color printing today. It used to be considered, color, how can we afford that? And so you mentioned magazines, magazines, a lot of them used to be part black and white and just a few pages of color. Now everybody prints everything color. It's not that much more expensive. But you're right, film is enough. Automobiles. I mean, if you're old enough to have driven a car in the 80s, I was explaining to my wife the other day, now that the weather is cold here, that, you used to have to go out and start the car and hope it started and let it warm up for 10 minutes before you dare put it into drive. Right. Now you just flick a switch and drive off and you take it for granted. So we like to always complain about things being not as good as they used to be. Actually, things are a lot better in a lot of ways. And printing, though, and typesetting and typography have advanced tremendously. The technology has done wonderful things. So to do Dr. Lamezo's catalog of American magazines, to achieve the quality of color in that is frankly much easier than it was to achieve the quality of color in Camellia 40 years ago. Both of them were done by very good printers. I don't use lousy printers or cheap, and there still are better and worse printers, but there's not as much as it used to be. It used to be that the, mediocre printers versus a Colish or a Steinauer was a huge gap. Now the technology is so good that the gap is smaller, but there are still better and worse printers.
So who printed Steve?
Stephen Lamezo's catalog was printed in the Czech Republic. We were just talking about Prague, weren't we? It was printed by a very good printer in the Czech Republic who's specializing in quality bookwork.
What's the name?
PB Tisk, T-I-S-K. We're talking about the technology, too, to send files. For me to send files over the internet to the Czech Republic or to China is very simple. It's not like we have to FedEx a disc or FedEx film, or, as we would have had to in the old days.
Who do you think the best printers are today?
Wow. Well, I think there are a lot of them. Oh, well, I'll say it. I use Puritan Capital Press in New Hampshire, and there's Penmore Printing in New Hampshire also, and GHP in Connecticut. And in China, I use CNC, who are excellent printers, and PB Tisk does a very good job. There are a lot of good printers around. There are a lot of mediocre printers still, too. But those are some of my favorite printers. For letterpress, Bradley Hutchinson in Austin, Texas. Have you come across him? Digital letterpress? No. Oh, you ought to track down Bradley and go see him. He has one of those Heidelberg presses, as I mentioned, that the Camellia book was printed on. He has a Heidelberg cylinder. He has two of them, one smaller, and he does beautiful letterpress printing. It's in Austin, Texas. So he is my letterpress printer, my go-to letterpress printer for sure.
So is it easy to summarize exactly what was so much easier about producing this catalog as compared to the earlier one?
Well, there are a lot of things, but as I mentioned about having to paste up those plates, 40 on a sheet or whatever we did, to do that by hand, I had to do a paste up that the strippers, they called them, then followed in the stripping department with film. It's a tremendous amount of manual labor, and to get it accurate, took a lot of effort and skill and knowledge. And now you're on the computer and you're going to, arrange those. There's skill and knowledge too, but you're going to arrange those on a screen, and you're going to have guidelines that can be exactly accurate. You can enter in coordinates, XY coordinates, and then you send that over to your printer electronically, and it's going to be exactly what you send them, especially with PDF workflow. So, frankly, it's much easier now, much more productive.
Now, what about the font on this Magazines of the American Experience?
Right. The display font for that is a typeface I very rarely use. It's Goudy Old Style, Frederick Goudy's. And then the text type is Caslon. And the reason is that Caslon is a face that was used for a lot of magazines in the 20th century. The New Yorker used to be
I thought so, yes.
And, it has that look. This is about magazines from, I can't recall exactly, but let's say from perhaps 1880 to, I don't know when the last one is. If it goes up to 2000, maybe it only goes up to the 90s. And, Caslon was a face that was very popular in America. And Goudy Old Style is a face by Frederick W. Goudy, the great American type designer. So it's an American typeface that was used in magazines and for advertising. His typefaces were tremendously successful for advertising typography. So, there's a chance that if you were to count every typeface used in magazines in the 100 years in the 20th century, or even before that, you might come up with Caslon and Goudy Old Style being the two most used typefaces. You might not. I'm sticking my neck out here, but Okay. Baskerville was used a lot too. But anyway, they were a reference to American magazines, and especially the display face, to use an American typeface that was such a popular typeface for magazines.
And what exactly do you mean by display face?
Display faces, there's text faces and display faces, and text is used for the body copy, for the main reading matter, and display is used for the headlines and the larger type and section openers. And often I'm actually a proponent of using the same typeface throughout a book. I would bet that 90% of my books use only one typeface, but often, you want to have a face that is a little different for display. And Goudy Old Style, while it's a wonderful, beautifully drawn face, is not that good for text, but it's good for display.
And again, you want the contrast, I guess. Is that
Sometimes the contrast, right? The extra richness, even, I'd say. It's like using two different papers instead of one paper, the variety, let's say.
And this is kind of glossy stock. So
That's
again,
right, because magazines, right? Wouldn't you say magazines are more of a glossy kind of medium as opposed to books, which are on uncoated most often, right?
Yeah. I love how this is all coming together, Jerry.
Yeah, I think you can become a book designer now, Nigel. You're getting, you understand how we think about these things.
Oh, no, I understand. I don't and can't do. So on this particular catalog, you picked a lovely kind of a dark powdery blue for the dust jacket. Why'd you do that?
Well, red is such a classic color and old-fashioned, let's say, and magazines are more cutting edge, more, stepping out there into other colors. And, you think of red and black, people often refer to printer's red. I think there is no such thing as a printer's red. What is a printer's red? But printers use red a lot, all different shades of red. Yeah. And, to go into a blue is a little more, stepping out there into the commercial magazine, glitzier world. That was my feeling. And also that cover image on the jacket was selected by Dr. Lamezo as the theme image, and that blue went well with that image of Uncle Sam on the cover. Yeah,
very much so. And then your end papers are such the beautiful complementary color.
That's the idea. Yep.
Really,
they go all together, like as you said in the beginning, that you want all these elements to come together as a harmonious whole. As you said, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, but they all harmonize.
Yeah. Well, you did a beautiful job on that.
Thank you.
As you do really, everything I've seen of yours is just.
Well, thank you. Very
really,
kind of you.
No, it's breathtaking, I think.
Wow. Well, I'll quote you on that, Nigel. Thank you.
Just sort of moving along, I just want to look at two different, in terms of design at least, types of booksellers. First of all, Jonathan A. Hill, mm-hmm. and second of all, Glenn Horowitz. So you've done quite a bit of work for both of these booksellers, and I'm so happy to have a nice collection of examples of both of their catalogs. But what's interesting is that Jonathan's catalogs are all exactly the same size.
That's right. He produces catalogs that are all the same. And Glenn, every catalog we handle differently. We start from scratch, almost every catalog.
Yeah, maybe you could just talk a bit about the difference there.
The difference is that Jonathan says he wants every catalog the same size, and with Glenn, we just talk about.
Now, I'm talking about how you approach these, their projects. Then, like it's almost like with poetry, there are rules that you have to stay within and push up against, and that theoretically produces some really interesting stuff. You've got more restrictions with Jonathan than you do with Glenn.
That's right. But, those limitations, could call them a challenge, but, it's kind of, I'd even say a little fun to work within whatever limitations you have. Now, with Glenn, we did a Nabokov catalog. We did several, but there's a very small.
I know. This one?
That's it.
I was going to bring that up.
That's it. That's the smallest catalog I've ever done. And, he wanted that one. I think there's no pictures in that, or one picture only. And he wanted that one to stand out because of its smallness. And that's right. So there you go. But there were other catalogs, that were very picture driven that were much larger. So, we look at each project with Glenn, we looked at each project individually and came up with some solution. Often it was his guidance, let's make this one bigger because we have a lot of pictures. But with that one specifically, he wanted to make an impact by its smallness. Oh, I'm so glad you have that. And then with Jonathan, he feels that he wants his clients to, have a shelf full of his catalogs, all the same size. And he has these 238 now catalogs. And both of them are valid. I'm sure you would agree. Both of them are valid approaches.
Oh, yes.
And my job, I never argued with either of them. I never said to Jonathan, we should do it a different size. And I never said to Glenn, make them all the same size. No, working within parameters is a big part of what a book designer has to do. Like you said about poets too. If you're writing a sonnet, you're working at 14 lines. If that's it. If you're working within those parameters, but you don't always have to write a sonnet.
Okay, well, just point to catalog number 232 of Jonathan's. You've got a beautiful, watery
marble paper
image. This is so lovely. That just sort of popped into your head as
Oh, well, no. Jonathan, before I started doing Jonathan's catalogs completely a few years ago, many years ago, 20 years ago, what Jonathan used to do was produce the interior of his own catalog himself. He used to typeset on his computer and just have me do the covers. Almost always, 90% of the time at least, they were pattern papers, some kind of marble paper or printed pattern. So that is in that style, in that vein of Jonathan having this beautiful marble paper. He actually used to send me files of all these different pattern paper images. Some of them were paste papers, some were marble papers, some were printed patterns, and say, pick one. And I'd keep files of dozens, if not hundreds of these, and pick one. In that case, I think he had that particular image. So it's a kind of a theme with him. It used to be much more of a theme to have a pattern paper for a cover. So that's where that cover came from. Nowadays, we pick a image. Actually, I think he almost always picks the cover image from what's in the catalog. That's often done. But that one, he wanted that pattern paper.
You've got, in this particular catalog, there's rubrication throughout the whole catalog.
Right. Back in 40 years ago, to print a catalog red and black throughout with color images was complicated and expensive. But now, if you're going to have as much color as Jonathan's catalog, to put the type in color doesn't cost you anything more. If there's color on every form, because you're printing color illustrations, and also way back in the days when you would by hand tape up these pieces of film for offset printing to get the register right. If you made color type, printers tried to avoid that because it was very hard to have the dot on dot register. And, if you see some of that early printing, you'll see the yellow hanging out a bit, or the red or the blue. But now, again, the technology is so good that we take it for granted that the register is going to be right on, and you could print type made up of dots of different colors.
Mm-hmm. So what about the paper? Is it all the same paper you use for his catalog?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there have been a few uncoated paper. There have been a few uncoated. Jonathan used to like coated. I've been trying to woo him away from. I like uncoated papers in general. He likes the brighter colors. So sometimes we still use a coated paper for the snappier color. But in general, I like an off-white uncoated paper. It's not too yellow, not too white.
And one of the things that's really outstanding about these is the legibility.
Well, that's the type, and using a decent size and a good typeface, differentiating the elements, having the titles stand out of it.
Now, I know that, one of the key things about a bookseller's catalog, obviously, is selling books. And you don't get your head into that, or do you? Like, do you think about how am I going to best present this so it's going to sell?
Oh, no. I don't think of it that way. I think of how am I going to make this book look as good as possible. It's the same as doing a bookseller's cat in that regard it's the same as doing a book of poetry or a novel. I just want to make them look good. I often say my job is to make it look good. It doesn't matter what it says. So I want to make it look good. I want it to be clear, people be able to pick out the different items and the illustrations go well with the typography. But I just want to make it look good. I don't think about selling. I'm not that crass, Nigel. I just think about.
That's right. You're an artist, Jerry.
That's it. I just think about the aesthetics of it. But hopefully they go hand in hand. Hopefully, if you have a good-looking catalog, it's gonna sell those books.
Right.
And I don't think of it. No, how is this going to sell something? No. I want it to look.
Well, no. I'm just going to say though, if you present the book in a certain way, it looks sexier and going to sell faster.
Yeah, sexy is not a word I use in association with my typography. So I just think of making it look good, and I think of the subject of the catalog. Some of his catalogs are of Asian books, and that may call for something a little different than, some of his books are just early printing, some of his catalogs. So, I try to make it go with the subject and make it look good. That's my goal.
Well, these Asian catalogs are absolutely exquisite.
They're a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun working on that kind of material.
They're works of art. They are themselves.
Well, thank you.
What about the fact that you are yourself a book collector and a book buyer? So how does that inform?
Oh, tremendous, Nigel. It's tremendous. How could you design a book without being familiar with all the beautiful books, not all, but with beautiful books in general. So it's and I never went to school for book design. I never went to school for design or typography. I went to art. I went to school for fine art, and I got mixed up in calligraphy, but never took a class in book design. My education on book design and layout is from looking at beautiful books, and I do own a lot of them. I do try to acquire them, and they're models for me, and they're inspiration. So it's a huge thing for me to have a nice library of beautiful books.
Well, you've written books about books too. You've got, and I suppose this is where you get your inspiration from. Here's a century for the century.
Those are some beautiful, inspiring books that I think can inspire everyone. Yeah.
And again, if you get a project, then you go to your library and look for what others have done in that subject area?
Sometimes, but it's more of a general thing. It's more that I look at these books all the time, as an avocation, and that somehow it seeps in the principles of what people have done to make attractive books. Once in a while, I do get a project and I look at and I say, well, let me see what someone else might have done along those lines. But it's more of an overall aesthetic and picture. It's more of an overall thinking about what makes for beautiful books in different eras.
Yes. Well, like for example, Glenn's catalog Against the Tide.
African American.
Yeah. It's got a kind of a classic kind of woodcut on the cover.
Right.
But not much in terms of illustration throughout the whole.
Those books were not, they're not like those Japanese woodblock books that Jonathan had, or the illuminated manuscripts in Camellia that H.B. Krause sold. Their books are of historical significance, but aesthetically, they may have some, historical look to them, but they're not really beautiful books. They're as some of the others. So the illustration was not that important. So what do we have, like 4 or 5 illustrations in the whole book? Or was it just
You've hardly even, if that. You've got one kind of big pullout.
That's right. That was a very important document, right? Randy Weinstein was the author of that catalog. He built up a huge collection of this material. Yeah,
there it is.
Yeah. So we just did a few duotones, right, because that was such an important document. And, it's nice to see those posters. They have a kind of impressive, gutsy typography. But it was not an illustration-driven catalog. Some like that little Nabokov catalog that we spoke about, that was not illustration-driven either. I think there was one illustration in that whole book. So I did a book for Glenn on Thomas Merton. We had one picture of Thomas Merton was the whole illustration. So there were catalogs that are not dependent on illustration for their appeal. And that's fine. I'm a type guy myself, so I never shy away from a purely typographic project. Far from it.
No, and of course these are important documents, and there's a lot of valuable information in the catalog about a lot of good writing. So you're really
Glenn wrote beautiful catalogs, very informative and very well written. Yes, his catalogs are very, very well done in that regard.
Just a couple more, just because this is the centenary of Ulysses, I wanted to pull out this absolutely gorgeous Joyce catalog, that you did for Glenn, and the first early upfront double page spread. There's a beautiful image.
All those editions of Ulysses. Yep, that was the point.
Yeah. Really,
that was the idea. Hit him over the head with all these different editions of Ulysses. Yep.
Emphasizing the color, the kind of teal color.
That's right. That certain teal blue is just speaks Ulysses to James Joyce people. Yep.
Okay. Why do you think what you are doing? Well, I think it's important. Why do you think what you're doing, and in particular, I want to just quickly read out something you said in Teaching Graphic Design History.
Stephen Heller's book. Yeah.
Stephen Heller. And here's what you say. Type is a tool for communication, and it can also be a tool to an aesthetic end, ideally concurrent with its use as a tool for communication. Like all tools, there are methods for its use to be learned and better and worse ways to use it. We serve our mission as teachers of typography best by instructing beginners how to use this tool called type. We should also keep in mind that type is a very technical and complex item, so there is a lot to learn. I don't want you to teach me everything about type, but can you just speak to what exactly there is to learn and why it's important to learn it?
Well, it's like I said, can you imagine using a tool? Let's say that you were building a house and you were sawing timbers and you didn't know how to saw those timbers to go together right, or where you needed to have an extra 2x4 and where you have to learn all that. And type has it's a technical item that you have to learn about kerning and spacing and tracking and X height. I'll give you just one example. Since people talk, sometimes a client will say to me, "Oh, what size type did you use? This type looks a little small. What size is that?" Well, I always have to explain that size of type is dependent on other factors, the visual impression of the size of type. So if you use 10-point Bembo, we were discussing Bembo was used in Camellia, that's going to look smaller than 9-point Times Roman because of the X height of Times Roman, and it's going to look smaller than 9-point Palatino. So you have to understand that and how all these factors, but that's just one, serif, weight. There's so much to understand about type if you're going to use it well. And so you wouldn't want your house built by someone who knew nothing about carpentry, where there's a lot to learn about, and even different woods, why this wood would work here and this wood wouldn't work there. And it's the same with type. You wouldn't want your books or typography done by someone who didn't know the technical aspects of type, and then different machines set it different. You have to understand letterpress printing if you're going to use metal type. There's a lot to know. I do want to say that when you were reading that quote about type, which of course, I wrote many years ago and didn't remember, it all rings true to me, but it's different than aspects of book design that we're talking about, and why good book design is another field, a whole other area. They're interdependent, but they're different areas.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? You look at some of the work that you've done with these booksellers and the Grolier Club and elsewhere, and you look at it and you think, Man, it looks so good. You're not exactly sure why it looks so good.
It's good. That's it. Yeah, but to get it to look good, you have to understand about book design, about type design, about printing. But I'm glad you feel that way, and there's some thought behind it, believe me.
Just finally, any books you can recommend for someone who doesn't want to read a whole bunch, but wants to go to a source where they can, these two particular things, typography and book design?
Well, of course, I'm going to say A Century for the Century, a book that I did. And there are lots of books. Robert Bringhurst, of course, has written a typographer's Bible with the elements of typographic style. A Century for the Century is about beautiful books in the 20th century. Mark Argetsinger has just done a book. Have you come across Mark's name? I trust you would have. Mark Argetsinger is an excellent designer. And he just did a book called The Grammar of Typography. That's a wonderful book on various aspects of type design and book design. There's a lot of book design in there, even though it's not in the title. There are actually a lot of books on this subject. So when I started, there were very few, but there's been a lot of books published on the subject. There's D.B. Updike's classic printing types. That's a bit more historical and technical. There are plenty of books on the subject. Robert Bringhurst did a book on Canadian book design a few years.
Yes.
I don't know if you come across that. And that
Surface of Meaning.
That's it. And it has a lot of good information about specific book designers. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of them. But there are a lot of good books out there. David Godine has just done Godine at 50, which is really about publishing, but you'll find a lot about book design. Have you heard of that book yet, Nigel? Godine at 50?
I went to his Godine at 40 celebration and interviewed him.
Wow.
No, I haven't heard
about
of
10 years ago, I'd say. Right? So he's just done a book on Godine at 50 about his publishing. He selected some of the books he's published, but there's a lot about book design in between the lines there. It's a lot about the authors and the titles, but about the design too. But it's not focused exclusively on that. There are a lot of good books out there.
Very good. Okay, well, you're still enjoying what you're doing?
I love book design. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stress in book design. Often there are a lot of deadlines that you have to meet. There are a lot of technical things. But yes, I do enjoy it. I love beautiful books, and to be able to work in producing books that are hopefully of a higher level than your average product is a blessing. Really is.
Well, it's a joy to talk to you and a joy to leaf through your books.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you.
Really, Jerry. So thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
I had to do it, and I look forward to speaking with you more in the future.
Very good. Why don't you end off with Jerry Kelly is
a book designer.
Very good.
What more do you want? I also do calligraphy and some printing, but I'm a book designer. So I do a little type design too. But book design is the main thing for me.
Thanks again.
Okay, Nigel. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.